Okay, I think we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome on this beautiful Wednesday night. It hasn't been raining today like it was yesterday, so that's a good thing. Welcome, everyone. My name is Daniel Seiler. I am the Cultural Program Manager at the German American Institute in Tübingen, and I'm so delighted to see all of you here tonight. And I would like to welcome everyone who is watching after the fact, because this will be stored on YouTube. Before we dive into tonight's talk, there's a couple of things that I would like to tell you about that are happening next week. First and foremost, we have a discussion that is happening next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central European Standard Time. It's a discussion with Dr. Nicole Hirschfelder from the Tübingen University and Esther Urban, who works with the Max Planck Institute for International Criminal Law in Freiburg, who will take some time and talk about the current state of affairs in the United States and Germany when it comes to racism, and especially anti-Black racism, because this is an issue that we can't get around, and we would like to take an opportunity to talk about and give you the opportunity to send in your questions. So if there's anything you would like to talk about, to see talked about, you can send questions in until this Friday, the 12th of June, at events@dai-tuebingen.de, and we will pass those questions on, and they will be discussed at 7 p.m. next Wednesday here on Zoom or on YouTube. And then on Thursday next week, we have a talk by Professor Christian Montag from the University of Ulm, who will talk about the influence and the effects that the growing usage of smart devices, of screen time, can do to us, and what these effects could be, if there is any hazard in it, if there is any changes that are happening to the brain. He's been looking into that for quite some time, and he will give a talk next week on Thursday at 7:15 as well on Zoom and on YouTube. Enough of that. We are on a bit of a schedule, so I will keep the advertising to a minimum. Talking about tonight, I mean, where to begin? Looking at the election year, there is so much happening right now that will certainly influence the debates that are going on about the elections. And there has been a lot of stuff going on in the last 2 years. Ever since the midterm elections, there has been a growing development of change, and things have been happening, and there's a lot to be seen when it comes to the elections in November. And I'm very glad that we have an expert on the issue here tonight, Professor Joyce Mushaben. She is the Curated Distinguished Professor of Comparative Politics and Gender Policies at the University of Missouri St. Louis. And she specializes in European and German politics, and she concentrates especially on questions of identity, gender, ethnicity, and migration. But she will tonight give us an outlook, an update on the status quo of what is at stake at the 2020 elections in the United States. And I am very glad that she's here tonight, and I will hand over to her. Welcome, Joyce.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I am going to be switching immediately to the PowerPoint, and then we will come back to the substance in a bit. So it says my meeting's being recorded. Well, that works out just fine. All right, now let me go to the wine glass down in the corner so that I can deal with this. Back in January, when I first agreed to give a talk reflecting on the November 2020 elections, there were still 10 candidates participating in the Democratic presidential debates ahead of the primaries. Now, most of us back then could still move about wherever we wanted. The economy was humming along with record low unemployment, and even crime rates were declining. I plan to focus on what I considered to be the 4 topics most likely to dominate the presidential election campaign. I was going to start with Trump's cruel and regressive immigration and asylum and detention policies. I was going to talk a little bit about changing attitudes towards climate, global warming, and youth mobilization. I was going to address a hot topic at the debates, namely Medicare for all versus Republican efforts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And then I was going to pick up women's reproductive rights, which are definitely being chipped away state by state en route to a major Supreme Court battle likely to be influenced by two religious zealots whom Trump has appointed. Since then, the world has been turned upside down by a global pandemic, and my own country has been torn apart by righteous anger over police violence and structural racism. The last time we were this divided as a nation, we stood on the brink of a civil war that turned out to be the bloodiest, deadliest encounter in our nation's history, at least on a per capita basis. For the last 3 months, most of us have been more or less locked up inside our homes. Our economy is on the verge of another Great Depression. Fears of crimes have been completely displaced by massive urban protest against the heinous police murder of George Floyd in what used to be known as Minnesota Nice, Minneapolis. A few days ago, I looked up the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 involving the race for the Illinois Senate, during which the Republican candidate, a guy named Abraham Lincoln, declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And then he added, "This government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free." His Democratic rival, Stephen Douglas, denounced Lincoln as a dangerous radical whose advocacy for racial equality and the abolition of slavery would disrupt, if not destroy, the Union. Now, Douglas won that Senate election, but he so divided his own party that he lost the presidential race 2 years later, rendering Lincoln the 16th president of the United States in 1860. This is one of those rare occasions when it might be comforting to see history repeating itself, at least in terms of electoral outcomes, but not, of course, in relation to the violent conflict between the blue and the gray states, now known as the red and the blue states, that followed. The events of the last few months have not completely undermined or invalidated the campaign topics I had originally planned to address, but the corona pandemic has certainly turned some of them upside down and inside out in ways no one could have anticipated. So I will begin by addressing the potential impact of demographic change on the November 2020 elections, with a brief discussion of new efforts to suppress voter turnout. I'll then discuss the negative, albeit glaring light that the corona epidemic has cast on the US healthcare system, or the lack thereof, in places where insurance options and acute care facilities are most needed. Next, I consider the extent to which other corona-related developments have ripped a very big bandage off the festering wound of structural racism in the United States. I conclude with a few thoughts on the state of democracy, but I'm going to keep all of these areas relatively short so that we'll have more time for discussion and then we can zoom in on all the data I have tried to compile. Although immigration has temporarily fallen off the electoral map ever since Trump started slamming the door on new arrivals, there has been a long-term consequence. Baby boomers are aging at a precipitous rate, and the birth rates are going down because migrants tend on average to have more children. That means that retiring baby boomers like myself will have to lean ever more heavily on the shoulders of younger cohorts that are also declining in size to finance our Social Security and Medicare benefits. We're seeing, as this map shows, a population shift to the South and the Southwest that is likely to cost Republicans in the reallocation of congressional seats if we ever get around to finishing off the 2020 census. The redistribution of seats in the House of Representatives will come largely at the expense of states in the Northeast and in the Midwest. Our children are at the forefront of this racial ethnic change. And what you don't really see in the table that I have on the left here is the complete number of people we might want to qualify as Latinx, because these categories are only for people who have declared one race. And of course, we know a lot of Hispanics may have indigenous blood or Black blood or whatever, and so a lot of people get excluded. But we'll see among the Latinx that that's where we've had the most growth so far. The children are also going to make a diversity, also going to create a diversity gap between older and younger generations. Whites now comprise about 66% of the eligible voters. And you can see there was already some kind of an upturn in the number of Hispanics who were voting and also in the number of Blacks who were voting between 1988 and 2008. The numbers of Latinx who have been born in the United States since 1988 has risen dramatically, and those people are automatically entitled to vote because they are citizens. More than half of the US counties, over 550 counties, have lost at least 5% of their residents since 2010. And the share of population over 65 is clearly increasing at the fastest rate. So let me turn now a little bit to the question of electoral reform. The national debate over electoral reform has also taken an unexpected turn thanks to the corona epidemic. We are still stuck with a totally dysfunctional electoral college system that allowed two men who had lost the popular vote to take the presidential oath during a short span of 20 years. But the COVID-19 epidemic just might make it possible for us to overcome other issues of voter suppression that are raging across the individual states. Of the various states, 35 now have laws requiring some form of identification at the polls as of December 2019. That doesn't sound so bad in and of itself, although you know we have a goofy registration system instead of automatically registering people when they, for example, get driver's licenses or change their residency. But over the last 10 years, 18 states have passed laws that require state-approved photo IDs. Now, this isn't much of a problem for the more privileged members of my society because we have driver's licenses, so we automatically have a state-validated ID. The problem is all those people who don't drive first have to get themselves to these official state offices. The IDs themselves can cost upwards of $75. They are often required to supply proof of birth in the United States. And this is something that older rural residents and even minority residents may not possess. Older Black women and older Black men were usually born at home because they were denied access to white hospitals in southern states, for example. This is also a new burden for persons with disabilities, for nursing home residents, and we know the elderly turn out in larger rates, higher rates than younger voters. Since 2016, another problem, the Supreme Court has rolled back rigorous monitoring requirements that were imposed in particular on southern states following the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, in the case that they challenge someone's ID, all of these states are supposed to provide preliminary ballots. The voters will sign an affidavit, but the ballots themselves are handled at the county level. So it doesn't take too much implicit, if not explicit bias for them to refuse to even grant preliminary ballots to these people, depending on their own prejudices. 16 states accept non-photo IDs, but we all have some way to verify our identification because we get voter registration cards telling us where our polling place is. A much bigger issue now looming will be that of voting by mail. 5 states currently conduct all elections entirely by mail: Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah. And that includes states that have Republican governors who think it's a wonderful idea. California will probably join them in November. Another 21 states provide some form of mail-in ballot for smaller elections like school boards. And these ballots are automatically mailed to all registered voters who mark the ballot, put it in a special pre-addressed envelope, sign an affidavit on the outside, and then drop it off in a mailbox or return it to a polling place by a given date. Now, Trump himself has voted by mail from Florida for as many years as anybody can count, and yet he attacks all efforts to expand this right to all Americans, claiming erroneously that it will induce massive fraud. Mail ballots, quote, are very dangerous for this country because of cheaters. They go collect them. Voter fraud, according to the experts, occurs in less than 0.04% of the ballots submitted. Ironically, the biggest known scandal to date took place in North Carolina in 2018, where Republican campaign workers went door to door collecting absentee ballots from minorities, promising to turn them in. This is illegal. When you have an absentee ballot, you must at least put a stamp on it and have it mailed to your voting district. So one district in North Carolina had to rerun the entire election. A representative poll from March 2020 suggests that up to 72%, including 65% of Republicans, support a mail ballot option for November 3rd. 2/3, 43% among Republicans, 65% among independents, also want those elections spread out over a 2-week period to eliminate long lines at the polling places. You know, we have this goofy system where we must vote on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of the month of November, which means a lot of people who have 2 and 3 jobs and may be commuting back and forth all day just don't have an opportunity to go to the polls. I will come back to the Georgia case at the end of this talk, but we have in this spring, lockdowns led Ohio, Michigan, Delaware, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, North Dakota, and South Carolina to permit mail-in ballots for the postponed primaries. Republican legislators in Wisconsin, however, obliged their voters to stand in line for hours outside of polling places despite the pandemic lockdown. The same thing, as I'll show you later, happened this week in Georgia. Now let me talk about Corona and what it has revealed regarding the woeful state of American healthcare. These are the general unemployment rates, and you'll see the darker the box, the higher the unemployment rate, greater than 5%. But at 5% is essentially people who have filed for unemployment insurance. There are a lot of people, despite the CARE Act, who are still not eligible. So this is not an accurate reading of how many people have really lost their jobs. The problem with unemployment is that more than 20 million US residents who finally got health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, have lost it because they are now unemployed. Black Americans, children, and small business owners had been among the top beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act, especially after 37 states had expanded Medicaid benefits to those living at or below 138% of the poverty level. After Twitler took the oath of office in January 2016, Republicans, who still dominated both houses of Congress, tried 7 times to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, as they had promised in their campaigns. They failed to do so even with a majority in both houses prior to November 2018. That was then thematized in those November midterm elections, proving that there were all kinds of voters who had come to value Obamacare a lot more than they thought. In fact, Republican promises to keep on trying to do away with it cost them the majority in the House. And since then, they have resorted to the federal courts, and they're hoping to make it all the way through the Supreme Court to chip away at the Affordable Care Act bit by bit. Corona has paradoxically accomplished what Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell could not. The Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that as of 3 weeks ago, 27 million people out of 158 million people have lost their health insurance provided by employers because of the job losses between March 1st and May 2nd. They lost their insurance just when they needed it most. Now, those 27 million people is a bit of a distortion because that means 27 million people have insurance that covers an estimated 78 million people by the time we include dependents. 80 million are also said to still be underinsured because the premiums are so high, they take the cheapest policies, and then when something happens, they're stuck. The COVID mortality rate, we'll come back to that, for Black Americans is 2.4 times as high as the rate for whites and 2.2 times higher than the rate even for Asians and Latinx. In New Mexico, the rate among Native Americans mortality rate is 8 times higher than the mortality rate. In Arizona, it's 5 times higher for Native Americans than for all other ethnic groups. Paradoxically, 1.4 million health workers lost their jobs in April, up from the 42,000 that had already been laid off in March. 135,000 of those were in hospitals that had eliminated all forms of elective surgeries and non-emergency treatment in order to make space for the coronavirus patients. Many places experience critical shortages, not only of the PPEs and the masks and the ventilators, although I have to confess that Trump is now exporting ventilators to other countries instead of sharing them with what he perceives to be democratic states like Michigan. But there's a lot less public discussion going on about people in places where the coronavirus has not yet peaked. The figure today was that 20 states have increasing rates of contagion, and there has been no peaking there, even though these are a lot of the states that have declared themselves once again open for business. The hardest hit areas are rural counties, where about 60 million US residents live, nearly 1 in 5, where their only option may be a local hospital, but these local hospitals that have not been closed down since 2005 lack critical care units. Indeed, 179,000 rural counties have lost their critical care facilities over the last 5 years. In 2019 was a record year for these rural hospital closures, 18. Only 45% of these rural counties even have a hospital-based OBGYN unit. And so now we're seeing, of course, increasing numbers of deaths that are not fairly distributed among the American population. Let me say just a word or two about the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is spread out across 3 or 4 states, roughly the size of West Virginia, covering 27,000 square miles of land across Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico in particular. The Navajo Nation is home to approximately 175,000 people. There are only 2 hospitals, one of which is run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, available to those people. One of them, run by the federal government, has 60 beds, of which 8 are in an ICU unit. By May 6th, the Navajo Nation had reported 2,654 confirmed coronavirus cases and 85 deaths. That number has now risen to over 6,000 cases. The other hospital, which is open to the general public, is the only hospital to be found for 100 miles. They terminated contracts for 14 operating room nurses and critical care nurses in March, and then they had 30 of those remaining employees test positive for COVID-19, including 10 nurses. The infection rate for the Navajo Nation stands at 3.4% compared to 1.9%, which we thought was so horrible in New York State, that is. The only good news coming out of this is that all states are now required to report coronavirus incidents based on race, ethnicity, age, and the sex of individuals who have tested positively. That's another hook we have here because we don't have sufficient tests in an effort to provide lawmakers with a better picture of the pandemic. Let me turn now to the economic impact of corona, which should become a main campaign theme. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the virus may cost the US economy $7.9 trillion over the next decade, But as usual, none of that pain will be shared equally. I have to say, it's pretty perverse. I got my retirement account statements this week. And even though I'm sitting here as a pensionista, I'm reading and I'm writing and I'm watering my plants and I'm feeding my fish. My retirement accounts shot up 20% because I'm one of those privileged people who has a retirement account that is completely dependent on the stock market, money market certificates, and those kinds of abstract investments. I'm not part of the real economy anymore. Many of us thought that Hurricane Katrina had taught us most of what we needed to know about the vicious grip of structural racism in this country. We saw tear-jerking photos of Black Americans, people in wheelchairs, who were stranded for days on bridges and highway overpasses due to a lack of preparation and a lack of transportation. Untold numbers of the elderly and the disabled literally drowned in nursing homes and hospitals because there was no way to get them up to higher levels. Unemployment right now has hit over 40 million. That is over 20% of those who are reporting unemployment, exceeding our Great Depression rate. While the gap between Black and white employment rates had just begun to narrow with the booming economy in 2019, Black unemployment still remained high relative to other groups. The District of Columbia has a Black unemployment rate 6.5 times higher than whites. Mississippi, the Black rate is 9% higher than for whites. Pennsylvania, 8% higher. Ohio, 8% higher. Louisiana, 8% higher. The highest Hispanic state employment rate is found, ironically, in Pennsylvania, followed by North Carolina, Louisiana, and then New Mexico. The biggest white unemployment rate is found in West Virginia, 4.7%. Although women comprise a majority of the least privileged laborers, they have been harder hit in this particular crisis than they were during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. They referred to that one as a man session. This one they're calling a she session, but I think it's going to come closer to a she-pression, giving us a whole new appreciation for underpaid, uninsured childcare workers, store cashiers, and health aides, not to mention grade school teachers. The shutdowns have redefined our understanding of essential workers. These are the people facing the greatest risk of exposure, and yet they're working at minimum wage. So for many, the $600 unemployment insurance supplement they received after they lost their jobs totaled more than their higher weekly paychecks. The group that has been hit the hardest, besides women in general, is of course women of ethnic background, and just as importantly, these women are concentrated to a much greater extent than white women in these very core and yet underpaid sectors of our economy. Women have not only been hit the hardest, but many of them are likely now to experience other complications because disproportionate numbers of ethnic women, in particular Blacks and Native Americans, are single mothers, are solo breadwinners. And so when they lose their jobs, the whole family loses an income, in contrast to many of the other groups that are married and can at least fall back on a second income. And we know that, of course, it's disproportionately white people who have the privilege of working from home. The no eviction rule that was imposed under the first congressional care package is about to expire. Texas has already declared that it will no longer protect people who cannot pay their rent beyond the initial 90 days that were written into that first CARE Act. Now let's think about this a little bit. This is going to produce more homelessness, heavy evictions, just at the point where we're all supposed to be adhering to social distancing. We know how hard hit prisons, nursing homes, and homeless shelters have been so far. And even though we only spend 15 cents of every discretionary dollar on education, we will now expect our children and our grandchildren to pay off the massive deficits and our exploding national debt, about whom budget-conscious Republicans say absolutely nothing. Our national debt is now running over $26 trillion. I'm not even sure how many zeros that has. We owe this massive debt to the so-called Trump tax cuts. Some of you I know personally, I've already complained to. My tax cuts under the Trump law were not cuts at all. I wound up paying $13,000 more last year and $8,000 more this year. People under $50,000 per year are paying more. People over $80,000 pay more, up until the $2 million limit. And it's only that small segment of voting population between 50 and 80,000, probably more likely to be a Trump supporter. And of course, the hyper rich who actually saw their taxes decrease during this period. Now, Trump has also increased defense spending. Nobody's even talking about that, and has some pretty excessive Secret Service bills. He's putting his Secret Service personnel up in his personal resort at Mar-a-Lago and charging the US government $900 a night for each hotel room. You would think that he could let them stay there for free, since they are protecting his life. And what better time for a trade war with China? Our precarious economic circumstances virtually guarantee that the most vulnerable groups will still witness even greater cuts in the existing social services than those made since 2016. I want to say a little bit about Ferguson, and I know that you will be having another talk on the nature of race relations, and I have a whole lot of data. I'm very happy to come back to all of these tables during the discussion, but we see that Black workers are more likely to be uninsured. Black workers are more likely to be in these kind of essential jobs. Black-owned businesses, small businesses have been hit all the more by the COVID shutdowns, and that's even before we start talking about the events of the last 2 weeks. Unemployment figures very unbalanced, Black women facing the largest losses. So I'm just going to kind of jump ahead to an example that I know fairly well, because my University of Missouri was only about 3 miles away from Ferguson Island. I had many students from Ferguson, and I also guest lectured there 2 weeks before Michael Brown was killed. Now, this I think is quite telling. You may not be able to see this. I have to move up Daniel's picture. But you can see that what's really a dramatic development in little towns like Ferguson is that this one went from being essentially 85% white to less than 29% white in a 30-year period. And what is driving this is largely the poor quality of the public schools. So that many white people engage in what we call white flight. And as a result of that, the people who remain tend to be in rental units. Property values are very low. There are not adequate property taxes to finance the schools, and that is why people flee. So within a 30-year period, but more importantly, just looking at the figure between 2000 and 2010, the dramatic increase in Black residents. Now, the other thing that's kind of funny, or not so funny, is that there is already such an extreme disparity just within the space of the city of St. Louis. Now, that gray circle over there, the Clayton area, is 2 streets away from where I used to live in St. Louis. And the other area is, as I mentioned, very close to my university. How is it possible that in a single city, there would be a life expectancy gap of 18 years between the mostly white suburb of Clayton and the mostly Black neighborhood of Ferguson? How could there be a 20% gap in the unemployment rate? How could there be almost a 50% gap in terms of people living beneath the poverty level? So we can see that people have a lot of good reasons to be angry right now over some of the other statistics that have come to light. This is prior to Michael Brown's death in 2014, where we see that Black people were disproportionately arrested, even though only 1 in 5 were likely to be carrying illegal contraband material, as opposed to whites who were stopped at a much smaller rate. Now, the other thing that was pretty perverse here was that Ferguson was so resource starved that they used traffic violations and parking tickets to fund the city's government. And that meant, of course, a lot more racial profiling. It also meant that once you got a parking ticket and could not pay that particular infraction, then they added a fine on top of that. When you couldn't pay the fine, you might eventually wind up in prison. And this became a major revenue source until after Michael Brown's death. There has been some revision taking place here, but not enough because the police rules are made by very different people. So this brings us to an unavoidable topic, the police violence, the race relations that we have had just thrown into our faces over the last 2 weeks. Derek Chauvin had no qualms about looking directly into somebody's running video camera during his agonizing 9-minute summary execution of George Floyd. Now, this was a guy who had already had 20 other violations of police rules involving people of color. Yet he never imagined that his performance that day would unleash the large protests that have shaken this country, more protests, larger protests than we have seen in almost 50 years. The war on drugs has morphed into a war against US citizens. Over 20 years ago, the National Defense Authorization Act allowed the Pentagon under the 1033 program to offer surplus weaponry to local police departments at discount rates. Now, these were the figures from 2010. By the late 1990s, 89% of the police departments in cities of 5,000 or more had purchased some of these materials, including military mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. Let's just call them mini tanks, M16 automatic weapons, etc. In the interim, 117 universities and 20 school districts have made weapons purchases provided by the Pentagon. That's $5.1 billion worth of equipment. So when you hear people talking about defunding the police, a lot of it has to do with let's stop spending money on these kinds of things and let's use it instead to enhance community policing, nonviolence, de-escalation training. One of the deaths of a Black woman, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, this woman was an EMT worker, a critical essential healthcare worker. She was in her own bed. And under some of the changes in police rules, the police had a no-knock warrant. They didn't even knock on the door. They crashed into the apartment. It was, by the way, somebody with the wrong name. The man, her husband, who was in bed beside her, thought it was an intruder. He pulls out his gun, and these guys in SWAT team equipment then fired Breonna Taylor, killing one of our essential workers who was going to get up that morning and go to the hospital in Louisville. Mm-hmm. War metaphors have been driving our public debates over crime for decades, but we never expected a US president to call out not only the National Guard, but also the border control, the ICE troops, Homeland Security forces, and the regular army to dominate peaceful protests in the nation's capital, where I now live. Defense Minister Esper started talking about battle spaces. 5 different forces showed up on the streets of DC, which of course has a somewhat special status. We're neither a state nor a territory, so this is the only place where federal forces can intervene, but their job is really to protect the federal monuments. And here they were occupying spaces that are literally owned by the city and not by the federal government in order to force out peaceful protesters. I won't even start talking about Trump in the church photo. But the problem here is that these people all showed up wearing no insignia, no name badges, nothing. And so there's no way to even identify those who might engage in some kind of abuse. This is how our nation's capital looks as of 3 days ago. You can see that this fence has been added all around the White House and the eclipse. So much for the people's White House. But the protesters turned out to be pretty smart, pretty savvy. Trump started talking yesterday about dismantling these fences. Why? Because we've turned them into a democracy wall. People have plastered these black fences with all kinds of protest signs, and I'm sure that's sticking in his craw. Our female black mayor has declared the street running down to Lafayette Square, this area up here, if you can, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but we now have a whole place, a whole square called Black Lives Matter. Protesters are not happy with that. They say, you know, the symbolic stuff is nice, but we want to see the changes. We have to teach our younger people that democracy is not an app. You don't just press a button and have changes occurring overnight. Now, I find all of this kind of troubling and amusing because I remember being in Magdeburg in the year 1994, 1995, where you might recall the Vatertag, where there were gangs of right-wing radical extremists chasing down dark-skinned refugees and foreigners or people who were actually citizens in the city of Magdeburg, chasing them around into a bar and then killing several of them. And so people invited me to participate in a roundtable session to talk a little bit about community policing in the United States. Well, we've certainly lost our role model function there. Under Obama in 2014, for the first time, police were required, various police agencies were supposed to start reporting the number of Black deaths at the hands or minority deaths at the hands of police. But only 40% of the police agencies have actually chosen to participate as of last week. Cory Booker is now pushing a law that would require reporting obligations for everybody. That means that people like Derek Chauvin can get away with 20 previous violations because according to rules set up by the police labor union, the police union in particular, those infractions tend to disappear from their records after about 3 years, or they can be moved to another county, another neighborhood, and that record doesn't necessarily follow them. On average, let's come back to those, I don't know if I can get back to what we had before. On average, we had 1,000 deaths a year, and these are the ones, of course, that have been recorded. And all these little red dots on this map are the places where the protests have taken place in recent days. On average, less than 22% of all police agencies have adopted a ban on chokeholds, Würgegriff auf gut Deutsch. Police charged with murder or manslaughter against Black or minority citizens have been acquitted, freigesprochen, in 99% of all the court cases thus far. So that is why Cory Booker and some of his allies are now proposing a much more rigorous federal regulation of at least sharing the data, the information, eliminating the no-knock warrants, etc. Let me come to my final section, undermining faith in both American democracy and the US Constitution. We've reached another critical juncture in the history of my country, a nation that used to stand as a democratic role model for oppressed peoples everywhere. Even if it often failed up to that pledge, they made us say every morning with our hands over our hearts that we were a country of liberty and justice for all. Yet here we are again, stuck with a completely dysfunctional federal government, with a president who seems to be mentally unhinged, with cabinet officials completely lacking in substantive expertise. Indeed, many of Trump's self-serving interim appointments were rejected even by Senate Republicans in early 2017 during their initial Senate advise and consent hearings. Now they're being accepted without a whimper the third time around, since Trump has fired so many of his original appointees, after others were then just randomly fired. And as interim appointments, they are not subject to Senate advice and consent hearings. Our federal district and appellate courts are being packed with Trump supporters and ideologues, many of whom have been labeled unqualified by the American Bar Association. That didn't stop Mitch McConnell in the middle of a global epidemic from calling the Senate back into session, not to pass a fourth care package, but to give one of his personal friends a federal judgeship, because since a lot of senators didn't show up, he didn't need a 2/3 majority. Republicans George W. Bush, heaven forbid, Mitt Romney, Colin Powell, and others have now publicly announced that they will not vote to re-elect Trump. 5 retired generals have renounced Trump's various leadership failures. At least those executives who have direct exposure to this man have decided to take a stand against his trumpeted lies and conspiracy theories, as have Twitter executives themselves. Mark Zuckerberg is a whole different story. Joe Biden has finally come out of his corona cocoon in order to make a number of semi-public appearances and critique Trump's lack of leadership. But you know, for most voters like me, I confess, I'm not looking up his speeches. I'm not looking up his campaign materials. The only thing we care about is that it be anyone but Trump. He can save all this money on campaign posters and simply adhere to the one. His greatest test will be not making any more dumb mistakes, like saying Black people who wouldn't automatically vote for him are not really Black. Now, let us recall, I've been thinking about this the last 2 weeks, that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated 52 years ago. Even more shocking was recalling that he was only 37 years old at the time. That means half of the US population has no direct memory of the civil rights movement. They have no idea how hard it was to secure the 1965 Voting Rights Act that has already been seriously undermined by recent court verdicts on voter IDs and our absurd forms of gerrymandering. You know, the Black Lives Matter group in St. Louis in 2014 called for an electoral boycott in 2016. When I told Black women at a Pentecostal church about that, they almost fell off their chairs. Martin Luther King is somebody these younger people, Black, white, whatever the public school composition is, are required to write an essay on during Black History Month. A recent survey of one school in my district area here showed that some kids even think that Eleanor Roosevelt was the woman who refused to sit at the back of the bus. These young protesters are going to have to find their own heroes, sheroes, and other role models. They're going to have to find some leaders, some real leaders with policy ideas. Although at least they've grasped intuitively one of the basic tenets of Marxism, that the economic superstructure determines the base of all other social and cultural relationships. Slavery was an economic institution. Sharecropping, Jim Crow laws were designed to protect the economic interest in the South. These younger people, I think, have finally grasped the fact the race question is a class question. Policymakers in the US finally need to recognize that there can be no race justice without class justice. A house divided against itself cannot stand. So that's what I've tried to prove here with all these facts and figures, leading me back to that question posed at the beginning: what's at stake in the 2020 elections? Practically everything. Our faith in democracy, younger people's faith in the rule of law, and just about any public policy you can think of that would contribute to economic justice, and of course, along with that, societal peace. Voter suppression, we've had a recent development yesterday in Georgia. Georgia refused to allow mail-in balloting for a primary. It was a record turnout for a primary, even though the number of absentee ballots was up over 150%, people claiming they were sick or that they feared the virus. You had to give a reason to receive an absentee ballot. We have people reporting they appealed 2-3 times to their county and never received the absentee ballot, forcing them to go to the polls. Faulty voting machines, Many polls that had been closed because they don't have enough poll workers, because people over the age of 65 who used to sit there doing a Democratic duty for 8 hours or 10 hours on election day are afraid to go out. They are the more vulnerable population. So there is word that a lot of these people waited anywhere from 2 to 5 hours to vote in a primary in over 100-degree heat, 39 degrees centigrade, and pouring rain. One study found that on average, voters in Black neighborhoods waited 2 to 5 hours, 45% longer than voters in white neighborhoods. And so we have to ask the question, who stays? Who can afford not to go home to their 2 kids they've left sitting alone? Who can afford to take that much time off from the job they might still have in order to vote? So what's at stake? Everything, but in particular, our faith in democracy. So the bottom line is, of course, it's the turnout, stupid. The very people who have taken to the streets over the last 2 weeks are the ones who hold the key to turning this country around. I mentioned the Black Lives Matter boycott. Black votes were down 20% from over 2012 because Obama was no longer running, and I guess they figured Hillary would win, or a lot of them didn't like Hillary's stance on criminal law reform, things along those lines. But even so, Hillary won by 3 to 4 million more votes in the popular count than Trump had. So the other problem here, millennial and Gen X voters. The millennials, that was their highest rate of voter participation ever, 50.8% in 2016. What kind of a sad commentary is that on democracy when we're boasting when 50% of a new generation turn out to vote? Many more of them did turn out, almost 58% in the midterm elections, largely over the gun issue after the Parkland shootings in particular. So these are the people we have to make sure sign up, register, and turn out on election day. 50%. Well, it makes a difference because Nevada, that used to be a Republican state, is now a Democratic state, except for the city of Las Vegas. And Nevada is the first state in the union to now have gender parity in its legislature. And the first thing they did was legalize the right to a morning after pill in the state of Nevada. So I guess that's the positive news here. We now have some very powerful Black female mayors in Chicago, in Atlanta, in Washington, D.C. And just this week, Ferguson, Missouri elected its first female and its first Black mayor in a 200-year history, Ellis Jones. The number of women candidates who've signed up to run in November has now exceeded 490. That's well above the 382. And we know that the more women run, the more they win. And that gives me hope. And so I'm going to end on that one note of hope I can offer. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. So now we have a good 20 minutes for questions. As I mentioned earlier, we are on a bit of a schedule. So if you would like to ask a question, you can either just type it in the chat in the Zoom window, or you can use the Q&A feature that you'll find on the bottom of this screen. If you hover over, there is just a little 2 speech bubbles that you can click where you can ask questions that then I can pass along to Joyce.
I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint for a while, but if you want some of those tables back, just holler.
Yeah, and I think you said earlier if people would like the PowerPoint
Definitely.
presentation, you can reach out to me at events@d.a.i-zu-ewigen.de, and I can forward the PowerPoint presentation to you. Maybe starting off with a question, do you think the American population can keep the momentum that they have at the moment with all these protests going on? Do you think this momentum that is happening at the moment can translate into really what you just mentioned earlier, the turnout that we need for the elections?
Well, I was asked last night, have the demonstrations, are they about ready to fade into the sunset? And I said, well, for one reason, they probably won't continue at this level of intensity because the temperatures are going up in all of these major cities. It's going to be 90 degrees here, 100 degrees yesterday in Georgia. Texas always has record summer temperatures. But the demonstrations have fulfilled their purpose. They have raised consciousness. They have conveyed a Wir-Gefühl. They've given a real sense of togetherness and belonging. The people attending the protest were bunt gemischt. I mean, there were blacks, whites, Latinx, Asian, LBGT, wie sie alle heißen, a lot more white people, sort of older middle class people, despite the fact that we are still in lockdown mode in the Maryland, Northern Virginia, and DC area, showed up at the big demonstration on Saturday. So, I mean, they're daring to come out even though they know there are other risks involved. Now, if we can keep that feeling together, what really has to happen now is that all these people have to turn around and get 3 other people to register to vote. And then they can become involved in local campaigns. And here I come back to that. Sounds like a trivial statement, but it's true. Democracy is not an app. These younger people are all fired up, but they have to be pulled in to these opportunities for mobilizing, because nothing will change unless the composition of the US Congress changes, and obviously the occupancy in the White House changes on November 3rd. Because the Supreme Court is set up in such a way now that these sort of crazies, right-wing extremists, conspiracy people, they're overloading the courts with cases where they are challenging every last shred of reproductive rights. They are challenging, and if it gets up to that Supreme Court level, we're doomed, particularly if my friend and comfort, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, has to be replaced between now and November. So we have to get the local communities. Yesterday, there was really only one speaker at the Floyd Memorial who said, people, you got to go vote. And this was an older member who had worked with Martin Luther King Jr. He was in a wheelchair, so he must have been in his 70s or 80s by this point. I mean, these are people who have to reach out to all the members of their own communities to get this to happen. The religious now are taking a different stance ever since Trump had his photo op in front of St. John's Church. The priests and nuns walking down the streets, the bishops here in Washington, D.C., making a public statement. So we need those people to mobilize others to vote.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question that came in from the audience, stating, I understood that during the previous 30 years, demographic changes have been significant, especially regarding ethnic contribution. However, this is not fully reflected by eligible population and contribution to the electoral results. How much will this increase the risk for uprising or more pressure from the street, in air quotes?
Well, I don't think the pressure is among that group. Let me go back and say a little bit about that changing demographic. We had dramatic rates of immigration between 2000 and 2010. An estimated 33 million people came into this country, and about 8 million were presumed to be undocumented. All right. Now, the problem is, first of all, undocumented have no hope whatsoever of acquiring citizenship and being able to vote. But that also means that these other people, the millions of them, have to have the courage to go out and seek citizenship. And many of them were often afraid to try to secure citizenship for themselves because they may be living with an undocumented partner. They may have brought their children in, the so-called dreamers, without proper documentation. But the fact that now we have all these younger Hispanics, Latinx actually, who were born in this country, who are now hitting 18 to 22, so the new generation of voters. Because the Bush administration started this, they cut down the number of people in the State Department who were there to be processing citizenship papers. It was a strategy to prevent people whom they thought would largely vote Democratic from getting the very voting rights that, of course, they came here hoping to get. So that has been a complete turnaround in the last 30 years. But Latinx population, they are less inclined to participate directly in these elections. We've seen higher numbers of them striking in places like Nevada and California because they comprise a significant element of the entertainment, leisure, recreation, restaurant business. And so they are more inclined to join unions and to allow for that kind of mobilization. So I'm not really thinking about these people taking to the streets because so many more of them are employed in jobs that white Americans don't want to do, particularly in agriculture and in some of those less appealing professions. The slaughterhouses right now, I mean, you're having your own problem with the, the meat processing industries and things like that. Well, that's where a lot of these people are concentrated, and what they want is better jobs, better pay, better insurance, and maybe a pension option as well. So I'm not anticipating any kind of real violence among this particular segment of the population. And the violence, let's be fair, these are traveling rowdies. I saw it in Rostock, I saw it in Hoyerswerda. I mean, people go looking for action, looking for trouble. They burn places down. Only the towns, the areas they burn down are not their own neighborhoods. In Ferguson, for example, we know that 80% of the rioters, looters, whatever we want to call them, who were arrested came from outside Ferguson. So we can't say this, we can't just paint the one minority or another with a brush of violence. There are always going to be crazies in the crowd who think they can take opportunity of this moment, just to, like football hooligans, to fight with each other and trash other people's neighborhoods. That's a very, very small component. And we've seen the last week that the peaceful protesters have gotten that element themselves under control.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we got: how important is it going to be whom Biden will choose as his running mate, like a woman of color, for example?
Well, I mean, like I said, my first thought is anybody but Trump. And I think I represent the voice of at least 80 million Americans who feel the same way. He could bring in Humpty Dumpty the clown and we would still vote for anybody but Trump. He has promised a woman that may have been a bit preemptive, but it's all right. And there may be some pressure on him to bring in a Black woman. And there are a number to choose from. People are talking about Amy Klobuchar, who's not Black. Kamala Harris did not prove very popular during the primary debates. Popular, yes, in California, but not with the rest of the country. So I don't think that would be a strong choice. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who almost won the governor's seat, is obviously capable of firing up voters and inspiring people to actually register, but she also has no executive experience at this point. There are other people, Maxine Walters, Barbara Lee, who've been sitting in the Congress for several years, who might be better options simply because they know how the system works and they are very happy to abide by the US Constitution. Will it matter? Yes. But to whom will it matter? People who otherwise didn't see a difference between Trump and Biden. That's why I think it is less important than we might initially hope.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question from a former resident of Tübingen, now living in Phoenix, Arizona, asking, can we shift finally our focus on our common enemy, Russian active measures? Is it not our most important duty?
You know what? Americans rarely care about foreign policy, about foreign economics. It's all about the job, stupid. I mean, if people feel that they are able to make it economically, we know that from 150 years of voting. And that's why the economic consequences of Corona could inspire many more people to actually go vote, because they're going to be increasingly desperate as we hit November, where a lot of these care package requirements are running out. Small businesses are going to be desperate, even in those places where they have been allowed to slowly reopen. So I just still think it's the economy, stupid, as Carville said when Bill Clinton was running. And what we're doing in terms of foreign policy, the travesty, even the proposal to pull some of our troops out of Germany, it's like, what are they thinking? Which has brought the generals out. But I don't think this is what really moves the American voter. A lot of us who are professionals read it and gasp. But we had the Mueller hearings, and nobody sat down among the sort of average, let me call them average voters who are busy, have lives, trying to manage family and juggle everything else. Those people aren't sitting down at night to read a 1,300-page Mueller report. I confess I didn't read the Mueller report. I mean, I read a lot more about it, but I didn't read the report. And for many people, that meant, well, as Trump said, oh, I'm exonerated. He wasn't exonerated, but not having read the report, they don't know that Mueller was not allowed to say, if I were able to indict this man, I would indict this man, because the Justice Department would not allow him to write that into the report. So I don't think those foreign policy issues, I was hopeful back in January, talking about the trade war with China, that farmers who are hurting deeply would now start to rally, because they can't sell their soybeans to China, and China is now turning to Brazil. China's not going to come back to the United States after getting an even better deal in Brazil and Central South America. So I was hoping that that is an economic issue would mobilize people, but I had no confidence whatsoever that they would be looking at the foreign policy implications of it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question that would be interesting to ask is, the turnout is something that the voters have to do. They have to, go out there and actually vote. And an effort to make that easier would be something like the mail-in ballot. But what are some other systemic changes to the process, to the voting process itself, that you would like to see happen? You
Well,
mentioned
none of
gerrymandering, but
Yes.
I'm
Well,
sure there's
gerrymandering, I talked about that last year and many other places. We can't change gerrymandering until we change the composition of the state legislatures, because after the reallocation of seats, after the 2020 census is completed, then whatever party is in charge of the Landtag gets to redraw the voting district lines. And so what we need is, a massive Democratic turnout to overthrow these Republican-dominated legislatures. In Missouri, the Republicans had super majorities in both houses, 2/3. So even if Democrats had tried to do anything, they could override even a veto if we had had a Democratic governor. But at this point, it's too late to change anything for November. What the individual states can do, and that's what California will do, is allow for more mail-in ballots, but that's not going to, the federal government doesn't set those electoral rules. And then it's a question of, if Republicans are in charge of the state, they're clearly not going to be as likely to want mail-in ballots, unless, of course, they're looking at how many hospitals they have, how many beds they don't have, and how many more people are likely to be hit by the coronavirus if they stand in line for hours on end just waiting to cast their vote. They could loosen up the absentee ballot rules, but that has to be done not only at the state level, but also in the counties. Some of these people are so crazy, these areas, they're introducing brand new voting machines 3 to 4 months before an election. Well, we saw what happened with the Democratic primary in Iowa when they tried to put together a new app, and it took them 2 weeks to finally get an electoral result for a primary. If anything, I would encourage everyone I could to please file a paper ballot. At most places, we still have the option. I have always used a paper ballot. And Gabi, this isn't just because I have a technology phobia, but paper ballots have to be retained and they can be recounted. It's a much better record, whereas people can manipulate voting machines. I mean, figure this out. I can go all the way to China, stick a plastic card in a money machine, type in 4 numbers, and I get real money, but we can't get voting machines that function. This doesn't make sense to me, but that's because these are private contracts, and these private contracts also have certain ideological inclinations. And paper voting, let's go back to the old-fashioned method. Let's expand the voting period so that we don't all have to race out on Tuesday, and mail-in ballots as an option. And I think that I'm pretty sure that Maryland, they sent us all mail-in ballots for the primary. This is my first time voting in Maryland. And I'm pretty sure that the state of Maryland will turn around and send us all mail-in ballots. Trump has complained because the state of Michigan sent every registered voter an application for an absentee ballot, not the real ballot. But then, you get counties sending these absentee ballots back saying your signature doesn't match the one we have on file. Well, we know that happens a lot more in black counties than in white counties. So we're not going to change the fundamental structures between now and November. But if we can change the composition of many state legislatures and change the composition of the other chamber in Congress, then we can talk about long-term electoral reform. And I wish we would talk about the elimination of the Electoral College.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid this is all we have time for because we have to be done by 8:30. Thank you very much. Maybe a quick last question. What is your gut feeling? Are you still hopeful for November?
Oh, I'm trying not to have any gut feelings at all. I was cautiously optimistic in 2016, and by midnight I was in tears. And I don't want to jinx anything. I mean, I cannot in my heart understand how people could continue to support the administration I've had for the last 4 years. But as H.L. Menkins once said, nobody ever got rich underestimating the intelligence of the American voter. So there's no lowest level in order for you to make some money off of it. So I'm not even going to hazard a prediction.
All right, then we'll have to wait and see. Joyce, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for this interesting talk and all the questions that you answered now.
All right, thank you for the opportunity. And hi, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there.
Well, some other time again.
All right, take care.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them, but as I said, we're running out of time. But I'm sure we'll have another opportunity to talk about this issue at some other point, and there is still some time to go until the elections are up. So until then, please be safe, stay home as long as it's necessary. If you're in the US and you can vote, please do so. It is important. And until we see each other again, thank you very much for being here and have a wonderful night. Thank you, Joyce.
Cheers. Cheers.